Welcome everybody to another Bible study, and we're continuing in Acts, and we've reached chapter 12. So we've been thinking about Peter going to the home of Cornelius, and the crisis that developed for the early church, and the issue about Gentiles becoming Christians. So this is a mind-blowing thing for them. They could never have imagined that God would want to bless the Gentiles, but he does. And so we've had that sense of autonomy and accountability last week, where we looked at the way in which Peter got on with his ministry without being instructed to do so other than God leading him. And he didn't need any authorization to do it. And he also looked at the church at Antioch developing and the relationship of that church to the church at Jerusalem. So we thought about their independence and yet their sense of accountability to one another. And we're going to move on from there, but before we do, we're going to pray. So let's just take a moment to be still and pray. Loving Heavenly Father, we thank you that we can take out time to spend with you, time to read your word, time to draw out truth and treasure out of your word. So we commit ourselves and our time to you, and those that may yet join us, and we pray that we may do so in love and fellowship with one another. Grant us grace as we listen to one another, and grant us joy as we listen to one another. So, loving Heavenly Father, we just offer ourselves and our meeting tonight to you, and we pray, come and bless your word to our hearts and glorify your name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. So let's read from Acts chapter 12, which is headed up in my Bible as Peter's miraculous escape from prison. I don't know I would have headed it, miraculous escape. Peter didn't have to do much to escape. He just had to follow an angel. But if we read the first 18 verses, okay, and then we'll come back and talk about it. Okay, so first 18 verses, and in any translation or version that you've got that you'd like to read to us from. And then as we do so, if you follow in the Bible that's in front of you, see if anything says anything differently that might strike you, or if there's something you've never noticed before, or something that makes you raise a question or uncertainty, or you want to comment, please feel free. Okay, all comments, all questions are very welcome. So don't hold back, please bring them to the meeting. Right, who's going to be reading for us?
I'll read some for you.
Okay, I think that was Clive, was it?
Yeah.
Okay, Clive. What version are you using, Clive?
New International, NIV.
NIV, New International Version. Right, okay, thank you. And we've just got Ambrose joining. Do you want to pause while we let Ambrose in? Thank you, David. You got there a split second before I did.
You asked me to keep my eye out, so I'm keeping.
No, that was good. I was very grateful to you. Welcome, Ambrose. You're muted at the moment and there's no picture. So, and John Ford is muted, and Michael, of course, is muted. Right, we're reading from Acts chapter 12, and we're listening to it from the New International Version as read by Clive.
Peter's miraculous escape from prison. It was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword, and when he saw that this met with the approval among the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. This happened during the festival of unleavened bread. After arresting him, put him in prison, handing him over to be guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. Herod intended to bring him out for public trial after the Passover. So Peter was kept in prison. The church was earnestly praying to God for him. The night before Herod was to bring him to trial, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and sentries stood guard the entrance. Suddenly, the angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him up. "Quick, get up," he said, and the chains fell off his wrists. Then the angel said to him, "Put on your clothes and sandals." And Peter did so. "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me," the angel told him. Peter followed him out of the prison, but he had no idea that what the angel was doing was really happening. He thought he was seeing a vision. They passed the first and second guards and came to the iron gate leading to the city. It opened for them by itself, and they went through it. When they had walked the length of one street, suddenly the angel left him. Then Peter came to himself and said, "Now I know without a doubt the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches and from everything the Jewish people were hoping would happen." When this had dawned on him, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. Peter knocked at the outer entrance, and a servant named Rhoda came to answer the door. When she recognized Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed, she ran back without opening it and exclaimed, "Peter is at the door." Wait a minute, Peter. Peter kept on knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. Peter motioned them with his hand for them to be quiet and described how the Lord had brought him out of prison. "Tell James and the other brothers and sisters about this," he said, and then he left for another place. In the morning, there was no small commotion among the soldiers as to what had become of Peter. After Herod had a thorough search made for him and did not find him, he cross-examined the guards and ordered that they be executed.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let's just try to, if there's anybody in the opening verses got any questions or comments, let's say up until verse 5. Okay, verses 1 to 5. Anybody got any comments or questions about verses 1 to 5? And then we'll move on. Otherwise, it's a long reading, and just try to keep our head chronologically ordered. And that's quite important, because this chapter is a Bible student's disaster in terms of trying to understand how it fits together. In a sense, what Luke has got here is he's telling us all about King Agrippa, and he's putting together stories about how King Agrippa related to the early church. King Agrippa was a new king, still fairly new, and if you try to square up the issue of when was the famine, we had a bit of conversation about this last week, I seem to remember. When was the famine? When did certain things take place? Just these last few chapters we've been looking at are not chronologically ordered. So this one starts with the phrase, "It was about this time," okay? So it's not chronologically in order. And so you're excused if anything doesn't look quite right and you're wondering how it all fits together, because it won't fit in with Paul and Barnabas being sent with money from the church at Jerusalem, at Antioch, to take it to the church at Jerusalem. Just doesn't fit together time-wise. But it's not meant to. Luke is telling us the story, and he's not necessarily telling it chronologically, and he is telling us particularly about the engagement with King Agrippa during this time. King Agrippa had been sent by the Caesar at that time. He'd had relationships with more than one Caesar, and he'd had quite an interesting career. He'd been a playboy at one time and spent a lot of money, got himself into debt, had to be bailed out of trouble. He'd been cast into prison at one time. He'd had quite an interesting background. And then somewhere around AD 40, I think it was, he was made the Judean king. He was the first Judean king since his grandfather occupied the post, and he was very keen to make a good impression. On one hand, he had to think about the Roman masters who occupied the land as part of the empire, and he had to think about the Pax Romana and or the Peace of Rome, and so he had to make sure that nothing happened to rock the boat. On the other hand, he liked to be popular, so he had to try to bear in mind what was going on with people, what was the best thing to do. And one more thing to say about him was that as part of the response to his particular position and the challenges of that position, he would do anything he could to crush any uprising. So if there was any kind of sect, a religious sect or a secular sect that was likely to rock the boat and cause a problem, he crushed it with an iron fist. So he was quite a significant character. That's the background to what we're looking at this evening. And that's what Luke is wanting us to sort of see. How did this man, who is in power and comes as the power against the church, how then did the church respond and react, and what happened? So that's what we're looking at this evening. I hope that's helpful to have a little bit of background to it. So verses 1 to 5, anybody got any comments or questions they would like to make or raise?
I hope it doesn't seem a tangent, but the death of James is covered with a very few words, though he was a leading apostle. The death of Stephen had quite a lot of coverage. And the other thing is that John was left bereaved of his brother, and John was allowed to live a long time. So it talks a bit about the sovereignty of God and the plan of God, but also it just shows that people are important, whether or not they're apostles. The Lord seems to respect in this, the believers who are being faithful.
Yeah, we were thinking, I don't know if it was last week, but recently, about the fact that within the account that Luke gives of the early church, the early Christians, that he mentions quite a lot of people. He doesn't just focus on one, and shows us that God takes and uses everybody and anybody in his kingdom, which is wonderful. If we want to be used, God will use us. And so that's fine. Thank you, Ambrose, for those thoughts shared. Just as well to note that James, that has been put to death with a sword, which probably means his head was chopped off, and it would have been a quick death. It was quite interesting, of course, that the Jews had no authority to put anybody to death. So when they wanted to crucify Christ, they had to come to Pilate and ask permission. However, Stephen upset so many people, they got angry and they didn't wait. They just got on and stoned him. But normally you would need Roman permission, and Herod Agrippa would have authority, so he could order it straight away. So this James that has been killed here is James, the brother of John, the son of Zebedee, the fisherman. Okay. James that's mentioned later on is a different James. He's James, the younger brother of Jesus, so a half brother of Jesus. Say half brother, of course. He's a half brother because Jesus had a different father to Joseph. He had a wonderful divine father, so he was son of God. Right. Okay. So that's about James. Anybody else want to come in and comment, ask any questions?
Well, it says he beheaded the brother of beheaded James, the brother of John, when he saw that the Jews approved, proceeded to arrest Peter also. So he attacked certain members, and
Yes.
the certain members were certainly the protagonists, people who would stick out. And James and John had a reputation for being outspoken, and so did Peter. So according to their characters, which it would seem that they were perfect targets for Herod. And
Yes, it's a very
a public
interesting
relations
Bob.
exercise, isn't it? This is what it's about for him.
Yeah, it's very interesting, Bob. That he's picked out James already, and now he's taking Peter. Two things I think that come out of the bit that you've been looking at is, one is the popularity of his decision, and that goes to his personality and character. He wants to be popular. He wants to be in. He doesn't want any revolt. He doesn't want anybody wanting to depose him. So doing things that please the Jews is important. And so that's really one thing. The other thing is that you said certain people out of the company of the Christians or the church, and there's something a little bit interesting in the Greek. I don't know whether anybody noticed that when Clive was reading from the NIV, it uses the phrase "some who belonged to the church." Now, anybody got a different version, and does it say anything different? So we've got King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church.
Is this in verse 6?
No, in verse 1.
Oh, all right, yeah. In the Good News, verse 1 says some members of the church.
Right.
And then in verse 6, it says, but the people of the church. So
Yeah.
they mentioned twice in that little section.
Yes.
It's the first time, isn't it, that the word church is mentioned?
It is indeed. And it's quite interesting that the phrase, I think, belonged to the church. Do you belong to a church? Are they your owners?
Oh, it's not the first time, John pointed out, because the end of the previous chapter, the church elders, in verse 30, church elders are mentioned. Yeah.
But it's in this period of time that we're getting the use of the word church.
Can I ask you a question on this? I've got the new English Bible.
Yeah.
It says attack certain members, okay, which I've already said, of the church. Now, the church. Now, the word church is spelled with a small c.
Yes.
Now, to me, when we talk about the church, where we talk about the church universal, it's capital C. If I was talking about the local church, it will be a small c.
Yes.
But certain members of the church, there is only the church at the time. So I wonder why it's a small c.
I think it was because it was the Church of Jerusalem that was the focus at this particular point. And James and John and they would have been part of that church. The apostles were based at Jerusalem, so they would have been part of the church at Jerusalem. We noticed when we were looking previously, when we were introduced to the church at Antioch, that that it referenced the church at Antioch and the church at Jerusalem separately. You're perfectly right about the use of capitals and small letters, lowercase letters, and in congregational and Baptist type situations, that's the convention. So if you're talking about a proper noun like Yelvertoft Church, it's not called that now, but it was. It would have a capital C for church there because it's the noun. However, if you were making reference to the church at Yelvertoft, it would be a lowercase or a small c, and you would keep a capital C if you're wanting to talk about the church globally or worldwide. So good point, Bob. Okay.
But it's more of an English convention rather than.
Oh yes, it's an English convention, and possibly not always followed by all different denominations. Right. Okay. But so we've got some thoughts relating to that. I was asking the question whether you feel you belong. Somebody said they had certain from the New English. Who was it talking about the New English Bible?
Me.
Oh, right. And certain of. Now, that's, in a sense, it's a very strange Greek expression that's used. And the word that's translated and used here for belonging is really the sense of coming from. So it's is that a preposition? I think it's a preposition. But it's the sense of something coming out of or from something. So it's translated slightly different. Most English translations use belonging to the church. Some have certain of the church. And that's just as good. In fact, it's a good way around it. Because I don't know that the concept of belonging is really what Luke was trying to get across. I don't think he wanted to say that somebody belonged to the church, like things belong to us. So it's not that sense of ownership, but coming from. So
is this
the other word
came from the church?
Yeah, sorry. The other word in this version is some from the church.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just worth commenting on and just dwelling on, because long ago when I was a minister at Hurstmonceux, we tried to break away from the kind of institutionalizing of church, and we started talking about people as being part of the church rather than belonging to or members of. So we talked about being part of. And I think it's worth thinking about what the church is and what our relationship is within the church. Right, that is the living body of people we're talking about. Right, any other comments or questions?
There's another thing here that strikes me. I'm sorry to keep going in like, but on this first sentence, it says it was about this time that King Herod attacked certain members of the church. Now, it says he beheaded James, the brother of John, and then arrested Peter also. But that doesn't really explain the situation, does it? Because if he says he attacked certain members of the church, it means that other members of the church that are not mentioned in this script, it implies that there are other people who are also being attacked.
Yeah, well, we don't know that for sure, but it's quite probable. That he was, it uses the word intending, and the word intending comes up twice in the NIV. So the second part of verse 1, Bob, in the NIV says intending to persecute them. So that's his plan. he
Yeah.
intends to persecute them. So I reckon that there were others who were suffering. I think that's very probable.
It sounds like a publicity stunt to me.
Say again, David.
It sounds like a publicity stunt.
Well,
me.
yes, I think it was.
I think he wants to become popular with the Jewish officials.
Yeah, he
Because
does.
he wants no trouble. So he attacks the people that everybody dislike.
Yeah,
Happen to be the Christians.
yeah. In the United Kingdom, it would be like Parliament passing a resolution to persecute the church, and the police sort of harassing Christians.
Yeah,
Not happening yet, but watch this space.
yeah.
You wonder why he didn't kill Peter straight off as well.
Ah,
I mean, Peter was very vocal because, you know, his sermons have been recorded and James's haven't. So
right.
you wonder what sort of trouble James was making to have made himself so conspicuous. I mean, was he named as the leader of the group?
No, he was. There's no record of
there's
him
no-
being described as the leader.
No.
He was part of the leadership because he was part of the apostles, and their role was to continue the teaching of Jesus to those who became Christians. We've only just come to a place where people were called Christians in Antioch, but just using that as a shorthand term. I think there is an answer to your question, why Peter wasn't dealt with immediately. If you remember, when Jesus was crucified, what was that just before?
Just before Passover.
Yeah, and that's what we've got again here. Okay, so it may be that it was getting a bit late, so he couldn't deal with Peter as thoroughly, but also we notice that he intends to make a public spectacle of him.
He definitely has got Peter there with intent to really have a show trial.
Yes,
Also, he really makes sure he's not going to escape by putting 2 chains on him and 4 cards. And
he
just about all.
certainly made sure he was pretty secure. Yes.
The fact that he was able to arrest certain individuals seems to me to point to the fact that they were probably out preaching. I don't know.
Well, I think that's an interesting comment, and may well have been the case. Otherwise, you know, we don't know whether James lived on his own or whether he lived with John, or, you know, we don't know. But he'd managed to get hold of James somehow. So however that had happened, we don't know. But he managed to get hold of James, and he had, I think, bear in mind the fact that this pleased the Jews means that it was a public spectacle. So the death of James was a very public event.
But Jesus had a nickname, didn't he, for James and John? The
Sons of Thunder.
Thunder.
Yeah. So again, he's not likely to be a wallflower, this man, is he?
No.
He's going to be quite public.
I don't know whether I was picking up on that, but James was one of the 3 people that Jesus had closer to him. So there are 3 occasions in the Gospels when we read of only 3 disciples being with Jesus, and those 3 are Peter, James, and John. So that was in the raising of Jairus' daughter, and on the Mount of Transfiguration, and in the Garden of Gethsemane. Right, okay, interesting Bible study if anybody wants to do it. Right.
I think that there is a kind of truth that the church's reaction to persecution was to go out and preach even more.
Yeah.
And I think that can be contrast to sometimes when we have difficulties, we sort of hide away a bit more.
Yes, good point. Right, any other questions or comments on the first 5 verses. Can we come back to the point that was made about Peter's position in prison? There's no definite idea of exactly where the prison was in Jerusalem. Possibly it was part of the temple complex. There was place there where there were soldiers, temple soldiers. So it might have been there. But wherever it was, he's behind 3 gates. So there are 3 gates or 3 doors before he gets to the outside. And he's being guarded by 4 men who are part of 4 shifts of 4 men. So 16 men, 16 soldiers altogether, okay? And they're divided, the 16 are divided into 4 squads of 4 soldiers in each squad. And 2 of the men were chained to Peter on either side. That's what's being described here. Okay, so he's chained to 2 soldiers. So even if he scratched his nose, you know, he would, a soldier would know straight away. So no dozing off for a soldier, and no opportunity for Peter to get up and move about unless he gets cooperation from 2 soldiers, both of them. And then the other 2 are guarding the next 2 gates. And that leaves the final gate, which is the iron gate, leads out into the city. So that's, you couldn't have anyone more secure. When a murderer is allowed to leave a prison, perhaps to attend a family funeral, he has to remain permanently chained. I've been in hospital, and I've been in one bed, and opposite me there was a prisoner who had 2 prison guards, just the one of whom was chained to him at all time. And if that prison officer wanted to leave to use the toilet, he'd have to swap the handcuff over so that the prisoner remained chained by 1. Peter's chained by 2. So you can imagine the complexities with such things as needing to have a toilet break. Right, okay. So it's a pretty tough situation, but I love verse 5. Starts with, or it includes that lovely word, but. So, says Luke, Peter was kept in prison, but the church was earnestly praying to God for him. So a number of things there that we could note, aren't there? It's pretty logical that they were praying to God. Okay, that we can assume is okay. But we're told what they were praying. They were praying for him. What were they praying, do you think? Were they praying that God would give him grace to bear any suffering that was coming his way? I don't think they were necessarily praying for his release.
No. You're so shocked by it.
Yeah. But they're praying for him. So it's purposeful prayer and it's earnest prayer. Now, if you've never prayed with a group of Africans, you may yet have the experience. Has anybody ever prayed with a group of Africans? Oh, several. So you know how noisy they are. And they'll all pray at once. So we're going to pray for brother Peter. So 50 voices are suddenly raised, very loud, shouting over one another to pray to God. And so this is earnest praying, and it's the church that is praying, not just a few people. There's not everybody that's part of the church is in the house where Peter goes to, but we're told that the church is praying. Do you have a church prayer meeting? Do the whole church come together for prayer?
No.
You know, So there's a real issue there as we stop and think about the efficacy of this prayer meeting. It's a church prayer meeting. It's the church that's praying, and they're praying earnestly. So things there, I think, that are important that Luke includes that we need to note. Is that okay? Any other comments? Okay, well, let's read on and come to the drama. So we get to verse 6, where the night before Herod was to bring him to trial, Peter is asleep between two soldiers. That amazes me. I mean, I think it would have been a bit uncomfortable and possible difficulty, but if it's nighttime and the soldiers are cooperating, because there'd have been possibly a 6-hour shift. So maybe they were quite happy to be able to spend some of it asleep. And so that, but it's Peter who is sleeping between these two soldiers, chained to them, with the sentries guarding the entrance, but he's asleep. Now, I don't know about you, but if I've got an important date the next day, if there's something significant happening to me, I find it difficult to sleep. Do you? But we've got Peter who's so peaceful that he's able to sleep. Then we get the angel of the Lord appearing. So the angel of the Lord comes into the prison room where he is, and a light, we don't know what this light is, but a light shines in the cell. And then the angel thumps Peter. He doesn't tap him on the shoulder, he wallops him. Okay. The Greek there is a hard hit. Okay. It's not just a tap. It's a hard hit. So the angel strikes him on his side, wakes him up, and then says to him, quick, get up. And the chains fall from Peter's wrists. Peter's wrists. Say it correctly in a minute. Right, okay. What's the other strange thing that's happening here?
Well, I always wondered how God dealt with the soldiers. Because
Exactly.
you think with lights and everything else, you know, that they would, and they'd know the chains falling off. It's amazing that they didn't wake up. Well, if they were asleep, they didn't wake up or didn't realise what was happening.
Exactly.
Maybe that's why. That's maybe why they had to hurry. You have to hurry.
Well, I don't know, but whatever it is, the soldiers are asleep. Apparently, we can perhaps assume, but they're not able to do anything about it. And if they're asleep, they've not been woken up by the angel talking, and they've not been woken up by the movement of Peter. And so quite amazing. They've not been woken up by the light, the bright light that's shining. So there is another side to it, which I always remember when I ask God for a parking space. If I need a parking space, I'm always mindful of the fact that he's got to get somebody else out of my parking space. So there's always another side to the story. All right, any other comments or questions?
Yeah, Barry.
Yes, John Ford, carry on.
I was just thinking the difference from the last time we hear about Peter about the same time of the night when he denied our Lord, and he was in the presence of soldiers then, wasn't he? Because it was before the cock crowed, so it would be in the middle of the night.
Yes.
And yet this is a completely different turnout than what it was then.
Yes.
Because I always think about we have a cockerel just in our yard, and every time he crows first thing in the morning, I'm always reminded of Peter.
Yes. And of our own weakness and fallibility, John, as well, how easy it is to profess to be faithful to God and then let him down. So we always
Barry, how God used Peter, and he can equally use us.
Yeah, absolutely. despite our weakness.
Yeah.
Right, okay, thank you for that, John. Right, any other comments, or shall we go on? Right, let's
I
go
was
on then.
just-
Right.
Sorry,
Sorry, was that somebody wanting to say
that's
something?
me. Sorry.
Yes, David.
I was just struck how God leaves it to the very last night before Herod's big spectacular trial of Peter to act.
Yeah, well, let's pause a minute. It may be that Peter's only just gone into prison, but nonetheless, the timing of it is fantastic, and God would have known what was going to happen. So, assuming the sovereignty of God in this, and that God's got a plan, who's it for? Who's going to learn from this experience? And so it's worth just pondering on that for a moment, maybe not discussing it, but pondering on it. Who's going to learn from this experience? As David's suggesting, this is the timing of it is quite significant. Okay.
Because
So,
Peter was put into prison, it says, during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. I don't know how long that is before Passover.
that's a week.
So he was in prison. He was in prison for a week then.
Yeah, he was, but obviously he could have been any time during that week. My own thought is that it possibly was the day before, but we don't know. Right, verse 8. The angel says to him, put on your clothes and sandals. Now, it's possible that he'd taken some of his clothes off then, but possibly used his cloak to cover him, to keep him warm. We just don't know. Put on your clothes and your sandals. Peter does what he's asked to do or told to do. Then the angel says, now wrap your cloak around you and follow me. So Peter does that, and he walks out of the prison. So he has to pass 2 more soldiers that are on duty. So that's all 4 soldiers fail to stop him. And then he gets to the iron gate, which leads out into the city, which presumably would have been locked as well. And that opens to itself of its own accord, apparently. And they go through and they walk the length of one street before the angel leaves him. And Peter finds himself out on the streets of Jerusalem, and suddenly it comes to him, I'm out. This is real. Because up until that moment, he's thought that he was dreaming, okay? And he doesn't think it's true, but now it dawns on him. So Peter came to himself, it says in verse 11, and later on verse 12, it says it dawns on him. So very, very interesting that he goes through the whole of that experience and thinks he's dreaming. Any other comments?
I was thinking about the angel. Have we got there? Yes. And the angel obviously had great power. And in the Bible, it's amazing what angels can do if they have the mind of God prompting them, or the instructions of God prompting them. And I think that we often think of angels rescuing, but angels can do various things, can't they? So to me, it's an exciting but also slightly sobering thought.
Say that last bit again, please, Ambrose.
To me, it's an exciting but also partly sobering thought.
Yes, yes.
Where God can use angels.
Yes.
It's strange, isn't it, that we a lot of us imagine angels always to be flying, and it was quite clear here, really, that he was walking.
Yeah, no, we blame Ezekiel for that.
Yeah, and that he was, that he was walking, and Peter was following him.
And also that he had a pretty solid hand with which he could thump Peter.
Yes. And I mean, a lot of the sort of New Age ideas about angels are very, very fluffy, aren't they? Angels are very sort of golden and gentle and sweet. and so on. Nothing like any of the biblical angels and other religion angels
No.
either.
No, and cherubims are baby angels, aren't they?
Oh,
So,
yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
all of that
horrible.
is rubbish. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So angels usually appear like in human form. Sometimes they are somewhat glorious and wonderful. But normally they're fairly ordinary looking people, and we're told that we could entertain them without realizing. So often ordinary. Jean is dying to come in. Come on, Jean.
It's just, we always draw angels in this white robe, but they're the white robes that Jesus and the people wore in those days. But with other people, we know we've developed in clothes, but with the angels, they stopped in this fashion of 2,000 years ago.
Yes.
And I was going to say to you, has their fashion changed too?
I'm sure it has.
So, yeah.
Our clothes now.
Yeah,
But
I'm
we
sure it
always
has.
saw angels in what's called the robes of Jesus' time.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, I was preaching on John the Baptist on Sunday, and I looked for some pictures. You'd be amazed how sweet and twee John the Baptist looks in most of the pictures, but he would have had long hair, and he would have been a scruffy individual, I reckon, dressed up in his camel hair clothes. You know, quite a rough kind of character. Does anybody know why John the Baptist wore clothes made of camel hair and held together with a leather belt? Anybody know what is the significance of that?
was that what the Nazarenes wore?
No.
It wasn't to do with Elijah, was it? It was
You've got it, Bob, right. It's what
Yeah.
Elijah wore. And of course, Malachi says that Elijah was going to come again before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. So, and we know that Jesus identifies John the Baptist as being the Elijah, not Elijah himself, but the Elijah that was to be sent. Comes in the same spirit, comes in the same power, comes with the same message of repentance and turning back to God. So all of that. So he was wearing appropriate clothes. Anyway, that's a digression, but it was about religious art, sometimes giving us a rather dreadful picture of things that aren't as down to earth as most of the Bible stories are. Right, okay.
just wondered how you. I just wondered how you would.
Sorry, Bob, I interrupted you.
I was just going to say, I just wondered how you would justify George Fox. He was always dressed in leather throughout, wasn't he?
Was
George
he?
Fox, yeah.
Oh, right.
Did you?
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Is that the man who prayed? That's not the man who prayed, "Give me Scotland or I die," is it?
I'm talking about the founder of the Quakers.
Oh, right, the Quaker George Fox, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there was that's another side of it, that if the clothing was a bit uncomfortable and scratchy, it was the kind of thing that mourners wore, like sackcloth, you know. Right, okay, moving on, because time is going. Okay, so Peter, and getting myself confused there, Peter comes to himself, he wakes up, realizes that this is all real, and he says, now I know without a doubt that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches and from everything that the Jewish people were hoping would happen. I picture Peter stopping and laughing his head off in that situation, you know. Now I realize that the Lord has sent an angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches and from everything the Jewish people were hoping would happen. If that's not a ha-ha moment, I don't know what is. So really wonderful, wonderful moment as the thing dawns on him. Okay, so as it's dawned on him, he goes to the home of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark. That's the John Mark, who later goes with Paul and Silas in the missionary journeys from Antioch. And he's also the Mark that wrote the gospel. And some like to say he was the young man who was with Jesus when he was arrested and fled from the soldiers, leaving his outer garment behind. We don't know, but only Mark tells us about that incident, so perhaps it was. So when he gets to the house of Mary, that's Barnabas's auntie, just to link you up with who's who in the Bible. Barnabas's auntie Mary. Many people are gathered. Now, we've already thought about the fact about the church prayer meeting. Here are many people who have gathered, so they've come together wherever they are. They're not just praying at home, but they've come into fellowship in prayer, good old gospel prayer meetings. And Peter knocks at the outer entrance. So possibly if you think of a house with a kind of a garden courtyard and an outer door, and Peter's bang, 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 bang on that door. Okay, and a servant named Rhoda answers the door, and she recognizes Peter's voice. And it says she was so overjoyed, not just that she was overjoyed, but that she was so overjoyed that she ran back into the house without opening the door and letting Peter in. And she tells everybody, Peter's at the door. Can you imagine it? Can you picture that in your mind and just see all that happening? You know, Peter, Rhoda, perhaps a bit annoyed. Maybe she's been called away from the prayer meeting. Maybe she's been told she's to go and answer the door. But anyway, she's gone. And when she gets there, Peter's apparently not only knocking, but he's saying, hello, will someone let me in? Hello. And she recognizes his voice, and she's so excited and so full of joy that she just rushes back. She can't contain herself. A bit like the disciples on the road to Emmaus, who didn't stop to do the washing up, apparently, but immediately went back to Jerusalem when they realized they'd been walking and talking with Jesus. You know, when you meet with Jesus or when you engage with a miracle that Jesus is doing, you get pretty excited, you know. So, right.
And if you're a woman, that's had that encounter, you go and tell people and they say you are mad.
Yeah,
Just
yes,
like
they do seem to. There seems to be a bit of a pattern there since Jesus rose, isn't there?
Yeah.
You know, yeah, that's the same sort of thing that they experienced then. Right, you're out of your mind, they tell her. You're out of your mind. But she keeps insisting, it is, it's Peter, it really is, honestly, it's Peter. And they say, it must be his angel. Now, there were some who believed that there was an angel, everybody had a personal angel. So that seems to be a prevailing thought at that time. Nothing in the Bible to suggest that we all have a personal angel. You can think you have
Sorry,
it, you'd
Barry,
like
can I
to.
challenge you on that? How do we know that's what people believed?
Sorry?
How do we know that? Have we?
Oh, I think possibly through Josephus, but certainly by other historical writers. I'm just quoting from a commentary that says that they did. So I'm presuming
the reason I challenge that, because that's very much a new age idea now that everybody's got their own angels.
Yeah. But the word is idea, as you've said. There's no evidence in the Bible to suggest it. Right. Okay. So Peter keeps on knocking, and they open the door and see him, and they say, "Oh, yeah. So we thought it would be you." No. They are astonished. That Greek word that's translated astonished means they were in mental confusion. They really couldn't cope with it. Okay, really astonished. Peter motions with his hand. I'll show you how you do that. Okay, that was, again, I'm quoting from books that I've studied and read. Okay, that's the normal practice, to motion with your hand for people to be quiet. Okay, So Peter motions with his hand and tells them all that God has done, how the Lord brought him out. That's why I think that the NIV's heading about Peter's escape from prison is not, he didn't dig a tunnel, he didn't jump over a fence, he just walked out because God did it for him. So he talks about how God has delivered him. It was for freedom that Christ has set us free, no longer to be subject to a yoke of slavery. So we're rejoicing in his victory, our hearts responding to his love. God has set us free, and we've been set free for freedom. So Peter motions with his hand, tells them what the Lord has done, and then he says, tell James, that is the James that in Galatians we read was one of the pillars of the church. Okay, one of the main key people in the church in Galatians. If you start at chapter 1, verse 1 and read through, you'll come to it somewhere in Galatians where it says he was one of the pillars in the church at Jerusalem. Right, tell James and the other brothers and sisters, hooray! Did you get that? Tell the brothers and sisters. Can we have a cheer from the ladies, please? We ought to have a cheer from the ladies. You know, there's so much in church that's male orientated. The early church wasn't male dominated, and although we only had male immediate disciples of Jesus, and they were all Jews, of course, Jesus spoke to people of other nationality, and he also spoke with women, and he gave to a woman the first message of his resurrection. So God does not prefer men before women, in my opinion.
Can I say the NIV just has brothers?
Oh, that's because it says adelphos. It uses the word adelphos. I'm perhaps being naughty, David. The word adelphos is for brother or for sister. So the NIV version that I'm looking at says brothers and sisters. Okay.
The Good News just says believers.
Well, that's a crafty way around it, isn't it? Right, okay. But adelphos, it could mean either brother or sister or both. Okay.
Nice word.
Yes. Right, okay. I've lost myself now. I'll tell the others. And then he left for another place. Okay, so we don't know quite where he's gone, but we do know what went on after he had gone. In the morning, verse 18, in the morning, surprise, surprise, there was no small commotion among the soldiers as to what had become of Peter. He was here. He was chained to me. Honest, he was. Last night when I went to sleep, he was chained to me. Wasn't he chained to you, Bert? Yes, he was chained to me too. Well, how did he get out of that then? You know, quite amazing. So they don't know. And there's this amazing commotion, noise that implies going on as to what had happened to Peter. Then in verse 19, we're told what Herod is going to do about it. Herod has a thorough search made for Peter and doesn't find him. Then he cross-examines, he also cross-examined the guards. So he really inquires. This is a shocking experience. So I come back to the question I asked earlier. Who was to learn from what God has done here?
Well, Herod, for one.
Okay.
And the poor old guards. But they didn't live long to be able to absorb it, did they?
Yeah, we'll come back to them in a minute.
Yeah. The church would learn.
Yeah. All the believers.
That God can answer little faith.
Yeah. All the believers.
And Peter himself.
I want to say me.
I was going to say, yes, Barry. I was going to say the church then and the church now.
Absolutely. Because I mean, I've referred to this, and verse 5 is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. Peter was kept in prison, but prayer was made without ceasing or earnestly to God for him. And that for me is a pivotal thing. You want things to change? We need to pray. And we need churches that pray. Sadly, my church does not have a prayer meeting. A retired minister from another denomination who's come and joined our church recently said, "When is the church prayer meeting?" We don't have one. And I kind of guess there'll be others here who say, my church does not have a prayer meeting. We must do something about it. We must do something about it if we want things to change. That but that's in there is so important. But prayer. Right, okay, so let's come back to the poor old guards. Herod orders that they are executed. Now, before that looks like a bit of overreaction to the circumstances, it was the regulation. And again, I'm quoting from information, various helpful books, reference books that I've been reading that tell me that if a guard loses a prisoner, they then suffer the same consequence as that prisoner. So in this case, he was going to be slaughtered. So they are slaughtered.
Oh, you got that with Paul when he was shipwrecked off Malta.
Right.
The soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners on the ship because if they didn't kill the prisoners, they would suffer the same fate because the prisoners would escape. And Paul stopped that. Paul saved every man on that ship, if you remember.
Yes.
And stopped the centurion from allowing his soldiers to kill the prisoners.
Yes.
So that it's there as well in that story.
Yes. Yes, yes. I think it's just important not to see this as a bit of overreaction.
Can I just make a point about Peter going to the house of Mary and then moving on?
Please do.
I think it's an interesting point because Mary, you know, I mean, I've done a little bit of reading myself, and it appears, you know, that Mary is a woman of some property.
Yes.
She has this house which acts as a meeting place for the church.
Yes.
Because Barnabas is there, and the cousin of John Mark, and so on. And Peter goes to her house. So it really does make sense for him, once it's established that he's out of prison, to clear off, because that's exactly where they're going to come looking for him.
Yeah.
You know.
Yes.
So I just thought that, and obviously quite a prominent house, and not a small house either, quite a large house.
It would certainly be a large house. We don't know that it was the only house where the church met. They may have met in a number of different houses. We know, for instance, in Rome, the church in Rome met in lots of different houses. So that was a common practice in the early churches, that often in one particular town or city, they would have a number of different meeting places. And that, of course, happens in quite a number of churches today.
Thinking about the guards, of course, it was interesting that the guards who were on duty when Jesus came out of the tomb, they weren't executed, were they? Because they were involved in the conspiracy.
Yes.
So it was sort of quite unusual.
Yeah, they were, very much so. And I love the fact that Jesus prayed for the soldiers who'd hammered nails through his hands and his feet, and prayed for them, Father, forgive them.
Of course, the Roman army had a practice of decimation, didn't it? If the troops were beginning to fail, they would line the Roman soldiers up and kill every 10th one, just to encourage them not to lose any more battles. Is that not right? Decimation. That's
decimation. Yeah, that's where it came from, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Horrible.
Thank you for that. Okay, any other final comments? Right, well, when we come again, we will come back to Agrippa. because, as I
Just
said
say,
earlier, that there's
again.
no chronological pattern here, and Luke is to some extent focusing on Agrippa. So Agrippa, whose power and authority was set up against the church, and God turns the tables on Agrippa. And he continues to do that, as we shall see as we discuss again a little bit more of chapter 12 and perhaps move into chapter 13, where all sorts of interesting things are happening in Antioch. Thank you all for sharing this evening. It's been a very interesting conversation, and I hope that we've all learned at least something new from this passage.